Clint Eastwood, a successful film producer, lived in a mansion that showed all the years of hard work he had put in. His life was everything he had dreamed of: wealth, respect, and influence, all earned through hard work and sacrifice. One of Clint's closest friends was Steve, a man he had known for years. While they once had a strong friendship, Clint's growing success started to create tension between them. Steve, who had always admired Clint's drive, began to feel jealous. Clint didn't notice the change, believing their friendship was still as strong as ever. Clint stayed focused on his work, unaware of the growing resentment in Steve. The jealousy was there, but Clint didn't see it coming. Michael was just a boy, no older than 16, huddled by the side of the road near Clint Eastwood's mansion. His clothes were worn and torn, his face dirty from days spent in the streets, but there was something about him, an alertness in his eyes, a sharpness to his senses, that set him apart. Life had not been kind to Michael, but over the years, he had learned to survive by trusting his instincts. He knew when something wasn't right, when danger was near. On this particular evening, Michael was watching the road when he noticed Clint's sleek car coming into view. At first, it seemed like any other car, but something about the way it moved caught Michael's attention. The car was swerving just slightly, as if the driver had trouble controlling it. Michael squinted, his sharp instincts kicking in. He knew the signs of a car that wasn't working properly. Without thinking, Michael sprang into action. He ran toward the street, his heart pounding, as he saw Clint's car getting closer. The boy's feet slapped against the pavement, his breath coming fast, but he couldn't stop now. He had to warn him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, a gut feeling telling him something was wrong. As Clint's car came closer, Michael shouted, his voice hoarse and frantic, "Don't drive. Your friend cut the brakes." The words spilled out of his mouth in a rush, almost before he realized what he was saying. Clint, taken aback by the sudden shout, slammed on the brakes, his eyes widening in confusion. Michael's warning had caught him off guard. Who was this kid, and how did he know about something so specific? Michael stood there, his eyes fixed on Clint, but his expression was urgent. There was no time to waste. Clint stared at the homeless boy, still processing the strange words he had just heard. "Don't drive. Your friend cut the brakes." The shout echoed in his mind, but it didn't make sense. At first, Clint thought it was just another scam, another desperate plea from a kid who was trying to get attention. After all, who was this boy to know anything about his car, let alone about something as serious as tampering with the brakes? Clint instinctively dismissed it, shaking his head as he ran his hand through his graying hair. The world around him had always made sense. Hard work, trust, and loyalty had brought him to the top. The boy was probably just another troubled soul, looking for a way to survive. He was used to ignoring the noise of the world, used to staying focused on his goals. But something about the boy's face, the raw desperation, the urgency in his eyes, made Clint hesitate. For the first time, Clint found himself questioning his own instincts. He stood there for a moment, his mind racing, trying to dismiss the thought that crept into his head. Could it be true? Could someone as close to him as Steve, someone who had been by his side for years, actually do something so vile? Steve had always been his confidant, his trusted friend, but lately, Clint had sensed a change. A growing distance between them, subtle but unmistakable. Steve had been acting off, like there was something Clint couldn't quite put his finger on. Clint's chest tightened. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fall into place. Steve's quiet resentment. His constant hints of jealousy. It was all there. The realization hit Clint like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a random warning. This was real. His best friend might just be the one who wanted him gone. Clint sat in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel, his thoughts racing. The boy's warning replayed in his mind over and over, like a broken record. Your friend cut the brakes. The words had caught him off guard, but now, with the silence of the car around him, they lingered in his thoughts, refusing to be ignored. Unable to shake the unsettling feeling, Clint pulled out his phone. His mind was made up. He needed to know the truth. He dialed his mechanic, Frank, who had worked on his cars for years. "Frank, I need you to come by the house, now. I think something's wrong with my car." "Everything okay?" Frank asked, sensing Clint's urgency. "I'm not sure," Clint replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just get here. Please." Minutes later, Frank arrived, and Clint led him to the garage where his car was parked. Clint could barely contain his anxiety as Frank popped the hood and began inspecting the vehicle. Frank moved methodically, checking the engine, the wheels, the brake system. Every few minutes, Clint would pace, his mind whirling with the possibility that someone close to him had betrayed him in the worst way. Finally, Frank stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Clint," he said gravely, "I don't know how it happened, but the brakes, they've been tampered with. Someone cut the lines. You could have been killed." The confirmation hit Clint like a punch to the gut. He stared at Frank, feeling a wave of dizziness wash over him. Michael's warning had been true. His best friend, Steve, the man he had trusted for so many years, had done this. Clint knew he had no choice but to confront Steve. There was no more denying it. He couldn't run from the truth. Later that evening, Clint invited Steve to his home. The tension between them was thick, the silence in the room almost unbearable. Clint looked at Steve, his old friend, the man who had stood by him through thick and thin, but now everything felt different. Steve's usual charm seemed forced, and Clint could see the flicker of nervousness in his eyes. "Steve," Clint began, his voice steady but cold, "I know what you've done." Steve froze, his face briefly showing a flash of panic. Then, quickly, he recovered, his defensive posture taking over. "What the hell are you talking about, Clint?" Steve's voice was sharp, but there was an edge to it, a slight crack that Clint couldn't ignore. Clint's eyes narrowed. "I know you tampered with my car. You cut the brakes." "Why?" He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of the accusation hung in the air. Steve shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before looking Clint straight in the eye. "You don't know what you're talking about," Steve muttered, brushing off the accusation. But Clint could see it, the slight twitch in his hands, the brief flicker of guilt that crossed his face. The mask of denial didn't fool Clint. "Look me in the eye, Steve," Clint said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you did it. And I know why." Steve hesitated, his jaw tightening. He didn't answer right away, but the silence between them spoke volumes. Clint could feel it, the truth was there, hanging in the air, undeniable. Clint's heart sank as he watched Steve struggle with his words. The friendship that had once meant everything now felt like a lie. "Why, Steve? Why would you do this?" Steve finally broke the silence, his voice cold. "You've got everything, Clint. The fame, the money, the power. I've been standing in your shadow for years, and I couldn't take it anymore. I deserve a piece of it. I deserve to have what you've got." Clint stood there, stunned. The anger, the betrayal, it all hit him at once. His best friend, the man he had trusted for so long, had wanted everything he had built. The world he had worked so hard to create had been threatened by the one person he never thought would turn on him. Clint sat across from Steve in the dimly lit room, the silence between them thick and suffocating. The tension that had built over the past few days seemed to hang in the air, settling heavily on Clint's chest. His heart was still racing, the weight of his discovery threatening to crush him. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Steve, once the man he trusted most, the friend who had stood by him through thick and thin, now seemed like a stranger. There was a coldness in his eyes that Clint had never seen before, and the defensive stance Steve had taken only made it worse. Clint had hoped, in some corner of his mind, that this would all turn out to be a misunderstanding, that maybe Steve's actions had been driven by something else. But deep down, he knew it wasn't a mistake. Steve had been plotting against him all along. "I don't understand, Steve," Clint said, his voice steady but shaking beneath the surface. "You were like a brother to me. Why would you do this?" Steve didn't look at Clint. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the ground, avoiding Clint's eyes. His lips tightened, and Clint could see the conflict raging inside him. For a moment, Clint thought Steve might deny everything. But then Steve finally spoke, his voice low and laced with bitterness. "Because you've always had it all, Clint," Steve said, the words coming out like venom. "The fame, the money, the respect. Everything. I've stood by you, watched you rise, and all I've done is fade into the background." He paused, his chest rising and falling with each breath. "I've spent years living in your shadow, and it's killing me." Clint's stomach churned. "Is that what this is about? You were jealous?" Steve finally met Clint's gaze, his eyes full of anger and resentment. "I was your best friend, Clint. But that's never been enough. You had it all, and I was left with nothing. I wanted what you had. I wanted your success, your life. I thought, if I could just get rid of you, then I'd have a chance to take everything you worked for. To finally be something." Clint's mind was spinning. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. His best friend, the man he had trusted with everything, had spent years quietly plotting his downfall, consumed by jealousy. Clint had never suspected Steve's resentment had run this deep. The betrayal was crushing, and Clint felt a surge of anger rise within him, followed by a deep, hollow sadness. "You were my friend," Clint whispered, his voice heavy with disbelief. "And this is how you repay that? By plotting to kill me?" Steve's face softened for a moment, guilt flickering in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a hardened resolve. "I never meant for it to go this far, Clint. But it was the only way. You wouldn't give me a chance to be seen." Clint stood up, his mind reeling from the finality of Steve's confession. He had trusted Steve with everything, and Steve had turned on him in the worst way possible, driven by years of simmering envy. The truth was out, and it hit harder than Clint had imagined. Clint stood alone in his study, the weight of Steve's betrayal still heavy on his chest. He had always prided himself on being able to read people, to trust those closest to him, but Steve's actions had shattered that belief. The anger was there, bubbling beneath the surface, but Clint knew that revenge wouldn't bring him peace. It wouldn't undo what had been done. He took a deep breath, pushing the surge of emotion aside. Clint had built his career on hard work, integrity, and an unshakable focus on the future. And now, facing the ultimate betrayal, he knew the best course of action wasn't to let anger dictate his next move. He had to take control. He had to expose the truth. Clint reached for his phone and called Michael, the homeless boy who had warned him of the tampering with his car. Michael, despite his circumstances, had proven to be more perceptive and trustworthy than anyone Clint had expected. The boy had risked his safety to help Clint, and now, Clint had no intention of leaving him behind. "Michael, it's Clint," he said, his voice calm but purposeful. "I need your help. I've got everything on Steve. I've gathered evidence, and I'm going to make sure the truth comes out." Michael's voice was steady on the other end. "I'm with you, Mr. Eastwood. Whatever you need." Clint spent the next few days preparing for the confrontation. His first step was making sure Steve couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. He called in a few trusted people, including his lawyer, to help him collect proof of Steve's involvement. Bank transfers, secret communications, and witness statements all pointed to the same conclusion: Steve had been plotting against him for months. But Clint wasn't content with just handling this privately. No, Steve needed to be held accountable in front of everyone. Clint's success, his reputation, had always been about more than just the money or the films he made. It was about doing things the right way, about leading with integrity. And in order to do that, Clint would expose Steve publicly. It was the only way to ensure that no one ever underestimated him again. The day of the public event arrived, and Clint's nerves were steady. He was about to announce a new business deal, a project that would push his production company to new heights. It was an exciting moment, but Clint knew it was also the right time to reveal the truth about Steve. The press gathered in the grand ballroom, flashes from cameras lighting up the room. Clint took his place at the podium, the microphone before him amplifying his steady voice. He smiled, greeting the guests and reporters, but there was a weight behind his words as he began to speak about his company's growth, the future of his work, and the team that had helped him get there. But then, as the room waited for his big announcement, Clint paused. He looked at the crowd and felt the gravity of the moment. It was time. He adjusted the mic slightly, his gaze scanning the room before he spoke again. "Before I announce our latest business deal, there's something I need to address," Clint said, his voice cutting through the silence. "A betrayal within my circle. A friend I trusted. Steve, you've been working with me for years, but what you've done is unforgivable." Gasps echoed from the crowd, eyes turning to Steve, who stood frozen at the back of the room. Clint continued, his words sharp but measured. "Steve has been plotting against me for months. He's been undermining everything I've built, including attempting to sabotage my life. I've gathered evidence, and I'm exposing it all today." Steve's face turned pale as he realized the severity of what was happening. His usual calm demeanor cracked, replaced by panic as Clint detailed the evidence, the tampered brakes, the secret communications, and Steve's long-standing resentment that had festered into something far darker. The room was silent, the weight of Clint's words hanging heavy in the air. The press, now buzzing with shock, began to report on Steve's betrayal. It wasn't just a business deal, it was the unraveling of a friendship that had lasted for years. Clint didn't give Steve a chance to respond. He simply turned to his lawyer, who was already coordinating with the authorities. Within minutes, Steve was escorted out of the room, his hands cuffed, his life falling apart in front of the very people who had once respected him. The shock didn't last long. The room began to buzz, reporters rushing to gather information, while Clint stood calmly at the podium. He had done what needed to be done. The truth was out, and Steve was facing the consequences. As Clint left the stage, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The betrayal had stung, but he had handled it with dignity. He wasn't defined by his mistakes, and he wouldn't let Steve's actions define his future. Clint had survived the betrayal, and now, he could move forward. In the aftermath, Clint turned his attention to the future. His new business deal was a success, and his company's next chapter was just beginning. As for Steve, Clint knew that justice would be served. And as for Michael, Clint made sure to take care of him. The boy who had warned him was no longer alone, and Clint made sure to give him a future that had once seemed out of reach. Clint stood by the window of his study, looking out over the sprawling mansion that had come to define his years of hard work and sacrifice. The sun was beginning to set, casting an amber glow over the estate. For a moment, Clint allowed himself to relax, his gaze distant as he thought back on the events of the past few weeks. Steve was gone now, his betrayal exposed and dealt with. Clint had reclaimed his life, his business, and his peace of mind, but it had come at a cost. The emotional weight of losing someone he had once trusted so deeply still lingered. The sting of that betrayal wouldn't fade quickly, but it had changed him. In ways he hadn't anticipated, the experience had forced Clint to confront what truly mattered in life. As Clint reflected, he realized that for so many years, he had been consumed by ambition. Success had been his driving force, his goal, and he had achieved it, perhaps more than most could ever dream. But in chasing after that success, he had lost sight of something just as important: trust, loyalty, and the people who supported him. Clint had built his empire on the belief that hard work and determination were all that mattered, but now he understood that without loyalty, those things could crumble in an instant. The betrayal by Steve had shown him how fragile trust could be. Steve's resentment had been hidden for so long, simmering beneath the surface, until it had finally erupted. Clint had assumed that friendship and trust were guaranteed because of their shared history, but Steve's actions had proven otherwise. In the end, Clint had learned a painful but valuable lesson: success means nothing without people you can trust by your side. But it wasn't just about the betrayal. There was also Michael, the homeless boy who had saved his life. Clint hadn't expected much from a kid living on the streets, but Michael had seen something Clint hadn't. He had noticed the tampered brakes, sensed the danger, and had done something that Clint hadn't even considered: he acted. That boy had risked his safety to warn him, and in doing so, had exposed a deeper truth about loyalty, about looking beyond the surface. Clint's thoughts turned to Michael. He had saved him, and now Clint had a responsibility to give back. Michael was a product of a society that had ignored him, written him off as just another statistic. But Clint knew that Michael wasn't just a homeless kid, he was someone with potential, someone who deserved a chance to build a better life. That's when Clint made a decision that would forever change the course of his life. He would use his success and influence for something greater than just personal gain.